Hello, this is Tim Congdon, Chair of the Institute of International Monetary Research at the University of Buckingham. Every month I do a video on monetary developments, sometimes in one country, sometimes around the world. It's mid-April 2026, and I want today to focus on my own country, which is Britain. And my topic is, could we return to the 1970s? Now, I'm approaching my 75th birthday, so it's roughly 50 years ago that was 1976. And that, in a way, was the worst year of the 1970s. There had been, in 1975, an inflation rate of 27%, the highest in British history, both wartime and peacetime history. And in 1976, when I started working in the City of London, actually as an analyst on government bonds, government bond yields were well over 15% at the long end. So 27% inflation and government bond yields of 15% plus. That was the 1970s. A lot more to say about it. It was a chaotic period, and eventually things came under control, and we had obviously some years later, some years of roughly 2% inflation and steady growth, but the 1970s were obviously something not to be repeated. Well, in the last 20 or so years, things have been going in the wrong direction, and the present Labour government, led by Keir Starmer, faces a test electorally, politically, next month when there are local government elections in Britain. They're expected to be very, very bad for the ruling Labour Party, and Keir Starmer may not last any much further after those elections as Prime Minister, because they are so bad that he'll be forced out. The repercussions of that for government bond yields, the economy, inflation are obviously very important, and there are serious people who are concerned that Britain might return to the 1970s. So that's what I want to talk about today. Now, part of the trouble here is that the government finances are not in good shape. In the 1970s, we typically had budget deficits of about 7% of GDP. They're a bit less than that now, but they have been somewhat too high, and the ratio of public debt to GDP has been rising. So we need to follow trends in the public finances and see in particular if there are any items of public spending which are on an unsustainable path. What I'm going to do today is to highlight in particular two areas of public expenditure. Public spending takes two kinds. It's spending on goods and services, education, health, defence. But then a lot of government spending is actually not where it itself buys goods and services, but instead it makes payments to people. Obviously that's part of people's income, and then people spend that income, and that expenditure is part of aggregate demand in the Keynesian sense. Now, it's these transfer payments I want to concentrate on today, and in particular on two main kinds. The first is interest payments on the national debt, and the second is pension payments. Now, I did cover the problem of debt interest at some length in my January 2026 video, and to some extent this presentation follows up from that. Frankly, debt interest is the craziest and stupidest kind of public expenditure you can imagine. It doesn't make anybody better off in any serious sense. It simply redistributes. It's paid for, it's the interest on the debt, which a lot of the debt is actually owned by people in the nation itself. So we're taxing Peter in order to pay Peter, and we're having all of the disincentive effects of taxation, all the burden of taxation, for something which is just purely handing things around in the same country. And in any well-governed country, this should really be very small. And then I'm going to be talking about state expenditure, state pensions, where there is a purpose to it, that it's redistributing from those who are working to those who, for the most part, have actually retired and aren't working, the elderly. I'm going to talk about that in Britain and whether that's under control and raise some concerns there too. I'm not going to talk very much about welfare benefits, but they too are something, are a kind of transfer payment, and there are worries about the control of that in Britain as well. But I'm not going to focus on that today. Now, debt interest was between 2 and 3% of GDP for quite a long time in the 2010s, and also indeed really for the first sort of 15 or so years of the 21st century. It was very much under control, 15, 20 years. But it has risen very sharply in the last 3 or 4 years and threatens to reach, say, 6-7% of GDP in 2030, even higher levels in the 2030s, unless there is, unless the deficit is brought under control. And since that January video, we've had numbers for February 26, which I just want to show you in this chart here. These are monthly figures for debt interest. In the 2010s, they start about 15 years ago, just at the end of the great financial crisis. And you can see that they were okay in the 2010s. That was because we had these very low interest rates to deal with the deflationary shock of the great financial crisis. Still under control even in the early 2020s, partly because many people thought COVID was going to be deflationary. That kept interest rates down in 2020 and early 2021. But then since then, you can see that shooting upwards at the very end, particularly in the very final month, which actually was February 2026, just after my video, as by coincidence. What I've done in this chart is show you the monthly figure compared with the same month 5 years ago. So what this shows you is the month of February 2026 at the very end, compared with how much that is higher than in February 2021. And then all of these numbers here are of that kind. They're comparisons with 5 years earlier. You can see that for much of the early 2020s, they're lower than 5 years earlier. And then that figure for February 26 is 3 times the level of February 2021. You can imagine if this carries on for a length of time, the impact of that on the ratio of debt interest to GDP, as I say, moving up towards these numbers of 6, 7, 8%, which, as I say quite bluntly, this is the most stupid kind of public spending. It's an index of a state's inability to govern itself. It's an index of the myopia and cowardice of the political class, unable to deal with, they've got to get the deficit down. If they don't do that, the debt runs out of control. The debt interest itself becomes a major item of public spending. I may also say that it's, to some extent, an index of how much influence Keynesians have on macroeconomic policy making, because it's Keynesians who don't care about deficits and excessive government spending, and they ought to. All right, well, that's debt interest. Really, as I covered that at some length. What about pensions? Now, I'm going to just talk for a few minutes about pensions in Europe and English-speaking world. This is a chart of pension expenditure relative to GDP in 5 European nations: Italy, Greece, Portugal, Spain, and France. Now, these are numbers of the 30 years from 1990 to 2020. In every one of these nations, in every 5-year period, the ratio of state pension expenditure to GDP increased. So at the end of this period, you can see that state pension expenditure is over 15% of GDP in Greece and Italy. The country at the bottom in blue is Spain, and then in between you've got France and Portugal. So we're talking about numbers between 10% of GDP and 16% of GDP. And these numbers have been going up relentlessly. Well, I say have, but I can make it. These nations were exactly those, not quite exactly, because France wasn't too much affected in the early 2010s. These were the nations called rather rudely the pigs or the gyps at the time, that were involved with the European sovereign debt crisis of the early 2010s. There has been very slow economic growth in most of them, not in Spain. Spain's had some decent growth in that period, but generally very slow economic growth. A lot of political tension in all of these countries about the control of pension expenditure. This is, in effect, the aging process. The more and more people become elderly as people live longer, and that has become politicized with tension between the working population and the elderly population. The ratio of state pension expenditure to GDP has fallen since 2020, although partly that's because 2020 was the COVID year when national output was hit. But in all of these countries, the problem of the unsustainability of the state pension systems, associated high levels of government spending and then taxation, the impact on incentives, the tendency of rich people to leave, etc. All these things have been problems plaguing these countries for some time. In that context, you might say, when we look at this chart here, that Britain's fine. Because you'll see here, this compares those 5 countries with Britain, that black bar, the USA, where, again, state pension expenditure is similar to Britain and beneath the OECD average, very much lower than in those European countries. And you might say, well, isn't Britain sitting pretty? And indeed, in much of this period, this difference in the state pension systems was critical to the fact that Britain did have a lower ratio of government spending to GDP, which then made it relatively attractive to inward investors. There was some economic growth, and in my view, it was quite important to Britain's international competitiveness, which is for debate. But the fact that Britain had a different pension system from most European countries was important to its a relatively good economic position. And then the question is really, what is Britain to be compared with? What I've included here is included the USA. What I can do now is include Britain, the USA, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Ireland, and Iceland. And you can see very low, the lowest numbers there, Ireland and Iceland. Ireland in particular, an economic success story. Low state spending, it's partly driven by demographics. Low state pension expenditure, low ratio of government spending to GDP, low taxes, attractive place to invest, massive foreign investment in Ireland, high economic growth. These numbers are very, very important. It's important in this context to clarify that because nations have got low state pension expenditure, that doesn't mean that the elderly are poor. You'll see, of course, Australia here. Now, look, old people in Australia are not poor. The point is that they have higher private pensions, and the balance between state and private pension provision is different between the English-speaking nations and these European nations. In fact, in Britain, roughly half of income for elderly people comes from private pensions, and also actually quite a lot from a lot of them still working, in fact. The fact that Britain spends less than most European countries on pensions does not mean that the British elderly are poor compared to those in Greece, Italy, and so on. All right. Of course, the Thatcher government and the Conservative government from 79 to 97 wanted, effectively, to privatise pension provision as they wanted to privatise the supply of electricity, the supply of telephones, and so on. That was a reforming government that did some critical things in this area to keep the burden of pensions under control, looking ahead, not just next 10 years, looking ahead 30 years. Sadly, that's not the current position in Britain. In Britain today, we have something called the triple lock, which means that pensions will rise by the higher of prices, national earnings, or if they go beneath 2.5%, a minimum figure of 2.5%. Apparently this 2.5% would apply even if prices were falling by 10%, but anyway, that's what's there on the statute book. What this means is that the ratio of state pension expenditure to GDP will rise as if the ratio of old people to the total population didn't change, because either prices are rising faster than national output, national earnings are rising roughly with national output, and of course the ratio of elderly to the population is going up all the time. So you might say the triple lock has got to change, and that's the view of most people about the sustainability of Britain's public expenditure in the long run. Again, let's just check the numbers, and this shows you the cost of state pensions relative to GDP going back about 30 years. And you might say, well, it's not too bad, is it? I mean, it started off just a bit under 5% of GDP. We finish off a bit above 5% of GDP. So is there a problem here? Well, in fact, there was a Pensions Act in 1995, which said that the age of entitlement to state pensions was to be increased. And I've set out the details of that here. There was an equalisation of the state pension age for men and women. There were increases from 65 to 66, and then there's one coming out from 66 to 67 in the next couple of years. All these things going back to something decided 30 years ago, when they were trying to look ahead to the sustainability of this part of public spending. Okay, so will we return to the 1970s? 1970s, large budget deficits, excessive money growth, rapid inflation, high government bond yields, falling pound. The key to getting these things under control, of course, was the Thatcher government. To some extent, the final half of the Labour government from 74 to 79, but it was the Thatcher government in particular that was involved with two critical decisions. The first, at the very start of her government, Thatcher, with support of course from her ministers, decided to fix the basic state pension in real terms that would rise only with prices, not with real output, meaning that even if there's some increased number of elderly people relative to the population, the pension was affordable because simply pensions being held back by the fact they're only indexed to prices. And by the way, that decision rolled through for the full 18 years of that government and is critical to understanding why today Britain has a low ratio of state pension spending to GDP compared with the European average. The second turning point on all this was the 1981 budget, where taxes were raised in a recession to get the deficit down, to stop debt interest growing. There was also the benefits from taxes on North Sea oil and gas output, and that then meant that Britain got its ratio of public debt down, got the debt interest burden under control, which then rolled through, as I say, through to the first decade or so of the 21st century. But I'm sorry, that's not the situation we're in today. I don't know, of course, how things are going to pan out after the local government elections. I don't know if Keir Starmer will be forced out. He may be. I don't know who's going to replace him. It'll be untidy, a bit of a mess, probably further rises in government bond yields. To me, we have really, obviously we've got these 3 years coming up of this Labour government. Then we have 50 years from 1979. We have 2029. 1979 was the start of the Thatcher government. It's really going to be the decisions taken by that government that determine whether Britain remains a respectable member of the advanced countries in a financial sense. My final remark is that we've seen some dreadful fiscal incompetence and mismanagement in Greece in the last 10 or 15 years. Italy's had many problems too. They're sort of under control at the moment. Democratic nations do ultimately bring these problems under control, but I think there could be a bit of a rough ride in the next 2 years, particularly under this rather, to me, rather unimpressive and unconvincing Labour government. Thank you.